Good afternoon, everyone. Kai, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sandra Labaskachny. I'm the Deputy Auditor General. And Caroline apologises. She's not able to be here today because she has taken ill. And before we start any other proceedings, I'd just like to acknowledge traditional custodians of the land in which we meet, the Whadjuk Noongar people, as well as the peoples from around Western Australia, as I understand there are several people online, and also to pay my respects to the elders past and present. So thank you everyone for being here, and for those who are joining us online as well, welcome. We do have two speakers in the guest lineup today. You may have heard that Peter Wilson would be here. Unfortunately, he's not able to join us. He was held up interstate with a lot of travels, and I'm guessing that travel problems will still be with us for a while. But we do still have a great lineup, and we'll do have Cam Aslam, who's our Head of Information Systems Audit, and he'll be talking to us about a little about the information systems work and the progress and the programs that we have. And Grant Robinson, who heads up our financial audit team, will be talking to us about some of the learnings and some of the trends in the local and state sector financial audits. I think not quite. Right. Yes, there we go. So it just has the agenda there. So I'd like to introduce firstly Cameron Aslam, who is, as I said, the head of our information systems and performance. He heads up our information systems audit area in the ISPA branch. He has served as 5 years as a director on ISACA, which is the key body for information systems auditing and controls. And he's really passionate about developing audit strategies as well as uplifting the WA public sector's IT governance maturity and management of cyber risks. A number of the reports that we have done in the last probably 8 years have been due to Cam's expertise and the work that he's done in this area. I'm really grateful to have him on board, and I think that if we have a look at some of the recent events of the last week, certainly things like the DP World hack, which we had provided information on for our protecting critical infrastructure audits, which I think is very important, and obviously Optus outage, which does kind of things. It's just raised the bar and the awareness, I think, and so I'm hoping that you gain and a lot of insights and information from what Cam has to share with us. So he has previously been a senior technical analyst for large organisation across a number of countries where he designed and project managed secure infrastructure and software solutions, including to support investigations, court reporting, e-discovery, and regulatory compliance. It's also included a number of Australian jurisdictions such as defence, courts and tribunals, and we're very, very fortunate to have him on board. So please join me in welcoming Cam. Thank you.
Thank you for the very kind introduction, Sandra. I would also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and also pay my respect to the past elders and present. So I would like to cover two things in today's talk. Firstly, our updated capability maturity model, which we have been using since 2022 audits, and also our current audit, which is underway on Essential 8 cybersecurity controls. Just setting a scene a little bit first. Cybersecurity has been a hot topic, as we all know. Sandra mentioned the recent DP World attack on Fremantle Port, and it also, as a result, shut down 3 other key ports in Australia, which mean the import of goods and traffic of those things into local businesses was halted for a number of days. Fremantle Port has been back up now in limited capacity, but nonetheless, it has really raised the awareness that cybersecurity is a real risk. It cannot be just an IT thing, but it's a real business risk. We've also had some big profile cyber attacks and incidents on Optus and Medibank, which again, unfortunately, but it did elevate the messaging around cyber risk in governance boards, in committees, and the importance that key executives now have the responsibility to make sure they're dealing with cyber risk adequately. Today, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre released its annual report, which shows there was an increase compared to last year in cybersecurity incidents. In fact, 43% of the incidents that affected Australia were from local, state, or federal government sector. So a big and alarming number that a lot of government departments are also under attack. So the attacks can emanate from a number of areas, and these threats mainly can be in the form of individuals, insider threats, for example, or a certain group that want to promote a certain message. Organized crime is very, very active in this space because there's a lot of money to be made. In fact, they don't need to be technical anymore. They can hire someone's services to attack entities or businesses. Their services are available on dark web. They sell it hack as a service now, like we had cloud as a service. And nation states who are using cyberspace to attack other countries as a weapon. So cyber is a weapon now. They try to disrupt power grids, take over communications, or in peacetime, they use cyberspace to cause espionage or steal state secrets. There can be a lot of impacts that come from cyber, ranging from unauthorized access to our data and to the spread of malware or theft of our data. These cyber criminals use many different vectors. Again, as I said, they could compromise our staff through phishing or sending them a link with malicious intent. Our mobile devices, we use and manage our lives with our phones. They are prime targets. But I think the key point here is suppliers. We're seeing an increase in suppliers getting compromised, and then through that, they come into government systems. As a government, we rely on a number of suppliers, and generally suppliers don't have as good security as the government department. So attackers have learned that very quickly, and most of the attacks recently have been through these supply chains. So it's really important that if your entities are using suppliers, have understanding and understand what sort of controls do they have to protect systems, or otherwise indirectly you will be compromised. These attacks can have profound impact on businesses. Medibank example I talked about earlier, so far they have had $1.8 billion in share loss value. So that's, again, almost $2 billion value loss they have had. They've also suffered reputational damage, and same as Optus, people are now trying to avoid those 2 big brands. So it can have a really, really deep impact. So just reiterating and setting the context that cybersecurity is here and is going to stay, and it's quite important. Our office has been doing a lot of work over 2 decades in the cybersecurity area. In fact, our first report that I could find was before my time here, is from 2004 when we talked about cybersecurity controls in the form of antivirus management. We've also been reporting from 2009 onwards our annual IS audit results. So these are audits which we call general computer controls, and I'll talk about that a little bit because that's the next topic I want to really highlight. So since 2009, we have been reporting the results of our GCC audit, also called ITGC audits. They are really part of financial audit. So the standards that our audits follow standards, and we comply with relevant standards to deliver our audits. One of them is ASA 315, which requires that all financial audit must have an IT audit done as well. And as part of that IT audit, we need to provide assurance to our financial teams that IT environment, which is a broad term, is managed well, it's secure, and the financial system they are auditing can be relied upon, and the numbers that the system generates can be relied upon. We've been doing these audits for a while, as you can see, And we also, as part of these audits, deliver a capability maturity model. So we test a number of controls in entities, and then we rate their maturity, how mature they are in those controls, and provide them through our CMMs, or capability maturity models. So the first topic is about what is the update to that CMM since 2009. So in 2018, we started trialing a newer version of that model, and it was not basically something really unique, but we expanded the categories. So we used to test 6 control categories, now there are 10. So the work we actually do in these audits has not changed much. It's still the same amount of work, but we have really segregated the security category to bring more awareness around cybersecurity and information security, and that's what I'll talk about. And our first annual report in 2022 work, which was tabled in 23, included the new updated model. The change in the CMM actually coincided with a change in the ASA 315 model. That's one of the guiding standards for us to do IT controls testing. The standard requires us to audit the IT environment, the key applications that entities operate, if they're on-prem or on cloud, regardless, we have to test them. And if they're in the cloud, we have to gain some additional assurance from the vendors, how they're managing the cloud. Network security, again, a very broad topic, databases, which are the back end of our key system. So these are all quite specifically spelled out in the new standard. In the old standard, they were not specific, they were very broad terms. So it's good to see some more clarity. As a result of this, while we didn't have to change much because we were already testing those areas, nonetheless, we have to test a few new areas. And that is mainly assurance from cloud vendors. A number of financial systems and payroll systems are now in cloud. We are paying them to use. We are paying to use them, or as a service they're called. In that case, what happens is entity that's using them, or as an auditor, we don't have visibility of how that cloud vendor is operating behind the scenes. We don't know what sort of controls they have, how are their backend processes, what system they use, are they secure? So it becomes kind of a black spot for us. And the way we are dealing with that is through SOC reports. So we are really encouraging entities, and we're testing that entities are gaining SOC reports from their cloud vendors, and then gaining assurance that controls are operating effectively. These SOC reports are prepared by independent auditors of the cloud vendor, and they provide a list of what sort of controls the entity has, what are the weaknesses, and what were the key findings. For example, in Victoria, a popular payroll system, their SOC report was qualified by the independent auditor, saying that controls are not adequate in the cloud. And if that was the case in WBA, for example, that qualification could extend to entities as well. So it's quite important to gain assurance through these SOC reports. The other important aspect of the SOC report is the user entity controls. The SOC reports clearly spells out these are the responsibilities that the cloud vendor has, but also these are the responsibilities that the entity must be undertaking. So using these reports, we can get some assurance that the entity and the vendor are operating the controls effectively. So that change coincided with the CMM change. So as I said, we have increased the number of categories. We have also changed the language a little bit to bring it to a more modern standard. And we have changed the criteria to be process-based than capability-based. So these are the 10 control categories that we now test in our general computer controls. As you can see, there are a number of security categories on row number 2, network security, endpoint, managed access, and human resource security. They all used to be in one category called security, which was fine, but I think that this now provides much better guidance and visibility on discrete condition of controls and which are the areas that really need to be targeted within entities' control framework. This is also a good time for me to introduce essential aid controls. So essential aid controls, you would have heard recently, there's a lot of work happening in the sector. We have always tested essential aid controls in these GCC audits. We have been testing them since 2009. However, our scope of testing was different. So if you can see those E1 to E8, so in these three control categories, we cover all the essential aid controls anyways. However, we do not test which brand of technology is being used to implement those controls, or whether these controls are implemented in line with the Australian cybersecurity requirements. We look at them from a general perspective, whether those controls are in place and working effectively. And before I talk more about Essential 8, I just want to highlight general trends in the sector. Out of those 10 control categories, we find that entities doing generally well in these top 4, the physical security, operations, change management, and risk management. But the areas for improvement are these, which mainly include most of the information security and cybersecurity areas. So going back to focusing on Essential 8 controls, so W government introduced a policy in December 2021, which has many requirements. It has about 27 requirements, and one of those requirements is to implement Essential 8 controls. It's important to highlight because everyone is currently fixated on Essential 8 controls, but there are 26 other things, which include security of your network, your risk management, your governance, your change management. So all those things must not be forgotten. So the policy requires entities to implement Essential 8 controls by 2024. That decision was actually made in 2023. For information. And these are the Essential 8 controls which everyone is heavily focusing on. These controls generally are parked in 3 broad categories. Number 1, prevention of malware. Secondly, improving privileges or controlling privileges to avoid breaches. And thirdly, if there is a breach, you can recover from them. So these are the kind of 3 key objectives of these 8 controls. These controls were developed by Department of Defense a long time ago, and part of their business called ACSC, or Australian Cybersecurity Centre, now manages and publishes these and provide guidance on them. Each control can be implemented from a maturity level 1 to 3, or 0 means you don't have that. And again, each level has very unique requirements that entities must meet to achieve that. The W government cybersecurity policy requires that entities implement these to at least a maturity level 1. And I will show you in a minute what that means. As part of the W government cybersecurity policies, entities are required to submit to DGov, or Office of Digital Government, what is their maturity in their view. So entities do a self-assessment, they assess their controls, and provide a report back to DGov. We are either 1, 2, or 3, and DGov then uses that information to develop a whole of government cybersecurity report or progress report for the minister and the cabinet to show what the maturity is. So we are now doing an audit in this space, and there's some very high-level key learnings that I can share. The audit is in procedural fairness, so I can't go into too much detail of the findings, but general messaging might be important for your entity as you inquire from them how is their implementation. So in the audit, what we did was we looked at what entities provided to DGov in December 2022 as their maturity in these 8 controls. We then ran some tests, some tools, which again the ACSC provides. So ACSC is the Commonwealth entity who developed these controls. They provide tools and guidance how you can test the maturity of these controls. And generally what we found was that entities were generally over-optimistic in reporting their maturity to DGov. That is the general message. And I will show you. So this is an example from 2 controls. As you can see that each maturity level 1 and 2 has unique requirements, and they're quite technical in nature. So what it means is they can be tested as well. So if entities have implemented first set, we tested that using some tools. And we then compared our result with entity self-assessment. And generally what we found was that they were over-optimistic and over-reporting their maturity. And it came down to a few different reasons. One was they were not testing their controls before filling out that self-assessment spreadsheets or documents. Because these controls are technical in nature, you really need to test them to understand whether they're working as they're intended to, and then complete that self-assessment to be more accurate. Or in some cases, different part of entity business had different understanding of the implementation. Some parts thought we had actually fully implemented, but they were actually partially implemented only. So ACSC is quite clear. If you are partially implementing, you can't achieve that maturity rating of 1 or 2. You have to fully implement the control. So what was the process that we undertook? So ACSC provides very good tools and guidance, and that's what we use to develop our audit methodology to test these controls. We ran these technical tests. They simulate an attack on an entity and then try to bypass those 8 controls. And if you can bypass, or if you can do the activity which is designed to be prevented by the controls, it means you fail. But if it's stopped, then that means they passed. So we ran those tests, and we also interviewed staff just to confirm our understanding, because there were some weird things as well that the test showed us. And we then did manual testing as well, just to be double sure that what we are finding or what we are seeing is correct. And then based on that, we issued the results to entities that this is your actual maturity, and also showed a comparison of what they thought they were and what we are. Now, interesting thing here is that no one talks about exceptions. As I said, these controls are generally quite technical, and in some cases you can't implement them, or you can only partially implement them because of the nature of your business. You have legacy systems. You have systems that require certain independence from the controls to be operating effectively. So ACSC does provide a way to have exceptions as long as they're kept to a minimum. So entities are allowed to have a business case presented to their accountable authority for approval, saying, look, we cannot implement because of these reasons, but there is a process they need to follow. And ACSC is again quite clear. If you follow that process, you can. And I have an example to share. One entity that we are not auditing in this audit, they have reached out to us to seek our input. Their IT team is trying to implement Essential 8 control, and by implementing one of the controls, their financial system has stopped working, because the financial system used a lot of macros to do number crunching, to create their financial statements, and also do their reconciliation. But their system is no longer usable anymore after implementing the macro control. So they are in a bit of a predicament what to do. So the implementation happened in a way that the IT actually blocked macros across the business. They did not take any exceptions into account. So ACSC does say there are ways where you can implement macros, for example, to all but that accepted area where there's a need, as long as you then implement mitigating controls, such as digitally signed certificates, and more importantly, create an exception plan signed by your accountable authority for 1 year. So it's time bound, which means in that time you are then trying to solve the actual problem, maybe replace the system or upgrade the system so it can then be applied with the actual control. So this is a missing piece that is not discussed too much. So if in your entity you're finding there are old systems which cannot comply with Essential 8, there is a process available. It is document heavy. You have to document everything. You have to document compensating controls, but it can be achieved. So I guess that's important to understand. Lastly, I want to talk about a couple of the better practice guides that our office has issued. So as Sandra mentioned, the attack on Fremantle Port, which is a critical infrastructure. So we recently tabled a better practice guide on how to protect from basic cyber threats if you are operating in the critical infrastructure realm. This was as a result of our audit, which was not publicly reported. So please use that. We also have another better practice guide in development on identity and access management. Through our audits, we find this is one of the key areas where entities need to improve access to their systems and networks, whether it be suppliers, contractors, or their own staff. So we are currently developing a better practice guide, and hopefully table this year, if not then earlier next year. But the Essential 8 report will definitely table towards the end of this month, so keep a lookout for it. And that's me. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
So do we have any questions for Cam? Any whatever? Yeah? Sorry, just we'll wait for the mic there. Thank you. Over here.
With Essential 8, do they update that? Has it been updated in the last 5 years? For example, some of the learnings that we got from Medibank and Optus last year?
Good question. So Essential 8 used to be called Top 4. 3-4 years ago, they were called the top 4 controls, so only 4 were included. So ACSC has been updating them every year almost. So what they do is they update the maturity model. The way you need to implement those controls changes quite often. The important thing to probably note here is also when we started the audit, the WA government were using the old maturity model. It's not using the new one. So we assessed their controls against the old model. However, this year, as recent as a couple of weeks ago, they have now started using the new model. So there are some subtle changes between each model, not significant, but some can be significant. So yes, they are updated every year almost. Yeah. There's one more.
Great. So more questions? Another one this side, Maria? Right. Sorry, we first have another question at the back there.
Yeah, hi, I'm sort of representing one of the port authorities, and the port authorities, whilst they're at different levels of maturity in terms of the Essential 8, they're certainly taking it pretty seriously. You did mention that often you get a bit of an inbuilt bias in terms of how management see how they're going. I'm just wondering whether there should be perhaps a more formal approach for boards particularly to get independent assessments prior to the end of December 24.
Absolutely. So as you recognise that there can be an optimism and bias, and other states who did audit in Essential 8, including New South Wales and the National Audit Office, they all found the same thing over the years. And it is absolutely important that boards and committees use someone independent who can go and assess. Caveat that not all firms have equal capability either to test those controls, and we saw that as well during this audit. Good thing in WA was DGov did recommend some key suppliers who can test your Essential 8 controls, and we generally found where those entities use that supplier, the assessment was reasonably accurate. So please, yes, absolutely use independent assurance before completing. And at some point in time, we are obviously limited in numbers. We will get to some entities, maybe your port authority as well in time. But until that time, yes, please use some independent person to assess.
Yeah, Sam Walsh, Perth Met. One of your earlier slides talked about the impact of a cyber attack, and it had social engineering. What does that actually mean? I know that I should know. Yeah, so, on the right-hand side.
Cyber impact. So social engineering is just where attackers take advantage of human psychology. They try to trick us into clicking on messages, or they send us a link with free tickets to a footy game. We click and the game is over. Or sometimes they call pretending to be someone to gain access to your account by resetting passwords. So it's about human psychology and taking advantage of that.
The new frontier of artificial intelligence and the request, I guess, for more organisations to use foundation models for training of data. Are you putting out any guidance in terms of how organisations can best implement training of the foundation models with their internal data and how that affects their internal audit controls as well?
I am aware that WA government is working on a policy on the responsible use of AI. However, as I said, we continue to develop better practice guides. While AI is not on the list at the moment, but it doesn't mean we won't do it. There could be a guide in the future on AI and responsible use and the risks that it brings to organizations.
I asked the question last time about OT and the extent to which you're going to audit embedded technology and operating technologies that generally fall outside the, if you like, the corporate and business auditing. And given that they're increasingly a target for attack, if you like, coming in through the back door, I'd be interested in where your interest in that is and what themes you might go to.
Right, so yes, you may have recalled or heard that Cam said that we had our guidance is based on an actual audit, but because of the significance and the sensitivity of the findings, we actually haven't made that report public, but just the guidance. So we have actually tested OT in infrastructure entities, and it is something that we decided that the best course was to put out that better practice guidance. We will be looking at probably doing some more, but we do have sort of limited resources, so it may not be in a while.
And probably in terms of what we tested, so we, outside of the business, we looked at their actual OT controls. How are they interacting with the key service they're delivering? And I'm trying not to say what it was, so it's hard to explain, but we went out the realm of IT and looked at the OT controls. We visited some physical sites where activity was occurring using those OT controls. We looked at the algorithms behind and how it's secured from the outside world. We looked at all sort of things which were a bit different to IT. However, at the end, IT security is equally important because OT systems are often now connected to IT. So we looked at that segregation as well in addition to those controls. Thank you. I guess that's it.
Okay. Thank you, Cam. And I'd now like to introduce Grant Robinson, who heads up our financial audit business unit. He joined us in 2021 as the Assistant Auditor General for Financial Audit, and prior to this he was a partner at KPMG for 38 years. There are several people in this room who will know Grant from his KPMG days as well. He's also very experienced as a non-executive director of various organisations, and he understands what it is that people in this room hopefully want to know and understand about, I guess, the trends in financial audits. So he's hugely experienced. We're very fortunate to have him on board, and so please join me in welcoming Grant to have a say a few things.
Thank you, Sandra. That's greatly appreciated. Hopefully the expectations aren't too high, because I can fix that quite easily. But no, I'm here to talk to you about the financial audit results, and a bit like Cam, part of what I'm going to touch on is the state sector findings, and because our state sector results report is yet to be tabled in Parliament, it's sort of, I can tell you some things, but not the detail. That will come in due course. So I'll touch on stuff and give you some trends and some insights, but the specifics will be held back for the time being. I'll then going to move into the local government sector as well. That results report, admittedly for last June 22, was only tabled sometime in August this year, and I'll touch on aspects around that. That is tabled, so I can go in a bit more detail on that one at this time. And because we haven't tabled it, we haven't presented it before, I thought it was appropriate for two reasons. One, because it's relatively new, albeit it's quite dated. But most importantly, we do have a number of participants both here and online from the local government sector, and it's important that they get the appropriate amount of airtime as well. So, to go forward, you have to look back initially. So it is a bit of a reflection, this session, and in both the state and local government, at their back end, I'll also talk about having seen what we see in the rearview mirror, we can then talk about some things that are coming down the road that we need to navigate our way through in the year to come. So let's deal with the state sector. Let me just go straight to this slide, and there is some information here, because without some information I'd actually not have a lot to talk about, but it is important. Two things, or a couple of things. We're at the moment, there's 130 state sector entities that fall under our state sector obligation to report to Parliament. We actually do more audits than that, but they're the ones we need to report and table against. There are 10 of those entities that we dispense with this year, predominantly the development commissions, on the basis that they form effectively part of DPIRD, and because of DPIRD's challenges, they were going to be late and the information's effectively covered. But we will be having to undertake those audits in the 2024 cycle. So 130 we are required to report against, 122 have been signed out. So there are 10, about 8 remaining. Now, this time last year, that was double that number and some problematic issues. So there are still a few outstanding, but most of the main ones are now done, which is great. You'll see 88% of those opinions have been issued within the 90-day period, and that's a significant improvement on where we were this time last year, where it was only just under 70%. So that's a significant improvement. And I guess one of the trends and themes coming through the state sector is there is momentum gathering and being achieved to improve timeliness, quality, but there is more to be done. As you'll see, there was 37 discrete qualifications across 19 entities. So it's a relatively small number of entities being qualified, and I'll touch on qualifications a bit more in a moment. Of those discrete qualifications, they cover both financial statements, as you'd be aware, controls and KPIs. Interestingly, this year, no qualifications on KPIs, so that's a great move forward. And there are lesser numbers, as you'd expect from those stats, across both financial statements and controls. There obviously are 8 outstanding, so those numbers may well, and our prediction is they are likely to increase somewhat between now and when we finalise. Regrettably, probably for the first time in the office's history, we've actually issued, and it was tabled yesterday, so I can talk about this, one entity has an adverse opinion on their controls. We have about 5 matters making up that overall qualification or opinion, but because of the adverse impact and the collective and pervasive impact of those findings, both individually and then collectively, we've actually ended up for the first time issuing an adverse opinion on controls. So that's, again, regrettably, we're breaking new territory. That compares with 45 qualification matters last year across some 20-odd entities. So the positive news, as I've mentioned, is that there is momentum gaining as we come out of the back end of COVID and other challenges, where the lie of the land is improving. What isn't on that screen and is important, but it's linked to the 88% being completed within the requisite timeframe, is that we have our own KPI of getting out audits within about 68 days. That's our target. Last year, if you've seen our annual report, regrettably, I have the privilege of saying it was our longest time frame to get them out the door. It was averaging of 92. But we are actually tracking at 72 this year. So while we are outside of our target, it's a significant improvement. And that obviously reflects both the hard work of our team, but most importantly, of you and your teams to get to that point. So as I say, the overarching trend is positive. It is gaining momentum, and there are significant improvements being seen across most entities. Those that have had problems, and I'll touch on those right now in the qualifications, you'll see that trend in recent years. So regrettably, since my tenure here, we've had records. I don't take any credit for it, and I'm not saying I take a hard-nosed approach to anything, but it does reflect, I think, the period coming through COVID and the changes that were invoked on organisations to be redeploying key resources to other initiatives, and then equally the machinery of government impacts did flow through. And we're still seeing that now, and while the number of qualifications and the number of entities is diminishing, what we are also seeing is the timelines for resolving some of those is problematic, and the harder ones that are recurring because they're not easy fixes. As I mentioned, there are reductions across both financial controls and KPIs. The extent of those qualifications, and in particular on controls, does increase and link to Cam's comment on the IS front, it does increase the likelihood or the potential for fraud and other errors, both inadvertent and deliberate, to occur. So again, the attention to these matters is of paramount importance for all of us. A positive aspect linked to my earlier comments about audit readiness. While the trend, when you look at it, might indicate that only 55% of the entities were ready within the 20 days, that is lodging their accounts by the agreed timeframes, it's marginally less than the prior year, but it's coming broadly back with the longer term track and history. I guess what we do need to try and do is get the reds down and those which are above 38 days down as much as we can. One thing we instigated this year from, you may recall from the presentation that was Caroline referred to at the last Audit Committee forum, was that we are and have instituted both in this 23 financial year for both state and local government, a need for all entities as much as possible to certify their financial statements prior to the final audit phase starting. We had mixed results with that this year in both sectors, I might add. The local government one is continuing. We're not so concerned about whether they're certified and lodged by the initial target dates, but it is. But before we start the final audit, we are very keen to have a certified version, because what that tells us, if it can be, in particular by the relevant accountable authority, is that it's gone through a due process internally. Where that was received, we did see an uptick in the quality of what we were receiving. That said, I can say there was one entity that gave us a certified version within the requisite time frame, and it's a discussion that we've had. It shouldn't have been certified because it had fundamental errors in it, which were relatively obvious to see. In that case, I think the finance team have done their DG a hard yard by putting something in front of them that they shouldn't have been asked to sign. So there is work to be done on that front. But linked to audit readiness is it goes to the quality of financial statements, is errors. Now, in case you're thinking I've picked the wrong slide here, again, and it's a busy slide, but this is last year's data from the end. If you may remember, we had a results report out just prior to Christmas last year, and then the part 3 of that report was about 30 June this year, which finalised the state sector information. What is relevant here is obviously that the financial statements, the number of errors that are identified, and we call it errors here. In the auditing profession, we typically call them audit differences, but that can be misinterpreted. In essence, there are errors in the numbers. Sometimes they're hard or they're firm numbers. Sometimes it's a soft calibration. And we've calibrated here between adjusted and unadjusted. What is important is that the number of audit differences, or certainly audit adjustments last year of 137, is pretty consistent with this year's number. So that's not a bad thing. Regrettably, the number of 1.8 billion in adjustments in total is significantly shy of this year's number. So there's been some much bigger adjustments going through, which is of itself somewhat still concerning for us, and highlights that while on one front we're getting audit ready, if one does that too hastily, it gives rise to outcomes such as this. Pleasingly, there were 50 entities that had no audit differences, and that's an improvement on last year. So again, I think consistent with the theme that things are on track to improve overall across the sector, and we just all need to remain vigilant to keep that trend going. One of the outcomes of our audits is our audit findings of both the financial management and controls, which give rise to our controls opinion, which can either be clean or qualified, as well as, and I'm only talking here the financial management findings, as distinct from the findings in our reports that come through Cam's team. What is interesting here, there were 452 findings last year, and I won't tell you this year's number, but it's circa of 100 less than that in that region. So that's a positive sign, as I say. It does indicate that where possible, organisations and you as chairs are ensuring that they're being actioned and appropriate action is taken and implemented wherever possible. As I've mentioned, there are a number of entities still outstanding, so that number is likely to grow. Well, not likely, it will grow, because the ones that are outstanding have some issues with them. So let's assume that number is going to go north. Well, the number I haven't told you is going to go north of the number that it currently is. What is interesting in this pictorial is that payroll and human resources are now represent 25% of the current number. And that's the highest that we've seen that, and it's actually now taken over from what has typically been the highest number of findings, which has been in expenditure, in the expenditure area. So again, positive in that one area is being actioned on, but it does highlight that I guess with the staff resources changes that have occurred over the system over the years, that probably the area that's been most vulnerable because of resource changes, that the payroll is probably the one that's now getting a bit of an uptick. So again, if there's an area to focus on, I think I've just told you what it is. What is equally interesting and probably more alarming, so while the number of findings is going down, what is concerning for us, as I suspect it should be for you as chairs, is that the number of significant findings of prior year issues that are unresolved from one year to the next is going up, and you won't see the percentage on that chart, but you can probably work it out when you have a good look at it. But also the number of significant, the dark blue findings, and as you know, when we rate our findings, it's significant, moderate and minor. The number of significant findings unresolved from one year to another is also on the increase, and that is of a disturbing trend. That said, to be fair, many of these findings are due to legacy systems, machinery of government changes and the like, and there aren't necessarily quick fixes to them. And these findings, this information, it could be a combination of both IS and our financial audit team findings. But if there's a focus for any of you as chairs within your organisation, it's on the prior year issues, because many of these now are rolling over for a number of years. So that is what needs to get your focus as much as possible. Now that's concerning. Let's back up. Fat fingers doesn't help on a small pointer. So what are some key things that have come out of this year's state sector season which might be of interest to you? And there's more than this which will be in the final results report. Firstly, climate change as an emerging risk. I'm not going to stand and talk to you about climate change. I know at the last Audit Committee Forum, Caroline did have a chunk of her presentation was on this topic. It's emerging. It's arguably in many respects it's here, but it's not here for state and local government reporting as yet. And so the key thing we identified this year, and I commend many organisations for seeking to get on the front foot and have disclosure and commentary around climate events and what they as an organisation may be doing about it. But we need to temper that enthusiasm with making sure that what statements may be being made or the implication or the intention of what you're conveying is indicating something which is not yet verifiable, supportable, both within your organisation and equally for us. Certainly this year we did have to moderate some disclosures in the financial statements from that which was presented to us to de-risk the commentary for a variety of reasons, one of which was we aren't actually permitted through Treasury negotiations to opine on anything really related to climate risk. So we need to make sure that the disclosures are not in there which indicate that we're giving an opinion on something which we're not yet privy to, being able to do. Also, and most importantly, there's no yet current guidance being issued by the accounting standards that's relevant to the public sector. and I know Treasury are working on that as we speak, of which we are part of. So, and in my recent discussions with Treasury, they have also confirmed that they are looking to put out some guidance at our request along the lines that any disclosures in the financial statements around climate risks should be moderated wherever possible. For some organisations, you will need to consider the implications of climate risks from a fair value or impairment aspect, as was done this year, e.g. Synergy, but you'll need to make sure that the implications are considered. I know from discussions with Treasury, a number of organisations had put forward some KPIs which are climate related, or at least partway related, and they've also been advised to remove those from being put forward for approval on the basis that they aren't yet ready. There's no guidance, and the systems and support for those is a little early. So again, watch that space. Again, I commend organisations for wishing to cover it. If you do feel you need to, the annual report might be a better place for it than in something that we have to opine on. But even then, I'd be cautious with how much you say and how far you go, because we also compare the annual report with the financial statements. Bank reconciliations and / restricted cash is an unusual one this year. We have qualified some entities in the last year or so on the use of restricted cash inappropriately, and that has occurred again this year. What equally is interesting, in some cases, the bank reconciliations, which you would think is a fairly standard and core, and it is a core control, but it's pretty standard. They were either not being done timely, or not being done appropriately. They were being done reconciling to different numbers. And in some cases, we had manipulation of what was being presented to achieve the outcome and parking numbers in a different suspense account. So again, you wouldn't think that would be happening, but it is something to be mindful of, as we certainly are. And as I've mentioned, there were qualifications this year, both on financial statements and on controls to do with both those topics, both bank recs and the use of restricted cash and trust funds. Combustible cladding is a different topic. Demers have come out with and some guidance on that when all this, I guess, first flamed up. No pun intended. And in particular this year, the health sector, Department of Health are leading a charge on that evaluation on behalf of most of the HSPs. Some have made some calibrations and adjusted for it, but in the main, it's something that's in train, and the Department of Health will be issuing. The intention is some guidance and some outcomes to those respective entities this year, but it also affects other organisations. The Education Department and Department of Training with their TAFEs also have cladding issues which need to be addressed. Probably the key thing for us in this, as we're seeing, is that many organisations aren't addressing this factor on the basis that we haven't yet been given appropriated funding to consider it. The obligation to replace, to address and possibly replace cladding has got nothing to do with funding. So that is something that we'll be focusing on as we come into this year. Valuations isn't on the screen, but it is a key area, and it's probably linked to the combustible cladding issue. We did have some experiences this year. As you all know, the state sector, the valuation services do their review of land and buildings and provide those valuations. There were a number of entities, strangely enough this year, who had received their valuations dutifully from that organisation, but hadn't done their own review of them. And as with any expert, they can sometimes inadvertently get things wrong. There's a multitude of spreadsheets behind all that, and there were a number when we challenged the movements which seemed to be excessively large or significantly decreasing unexpectedly and not intuitively anticipated. When inquiries were made, adjustments were made because there were some errors in their formulas. So again, it's not to indicate that they've got anything wrong, but things can happen. So again, the messaging here is making sure that you and your finance teams are actually reviewing what's coming back to make sure it actually passes the sense test. There were some GTE reforms, which I know created some challenge for some entities and for us. The regulations were amended with effect from 1 July last year and took effect for the reporting season, which was unfortunate because it also didn't come out with any particular guidance from Treasury on the application of it under the FAA transitional provisions. So we actually had to make our own interpretations and provide some guidance. And I know we had a number of instances where we were providing some feedback on the governance requirements, e.g. the director's declarations and the like. So again, apologies for any inconvenience caused on that front, but that was actually as a result of us having to make our own interpretations when legislation was enacted post-year end, but effective for the year end. And as mentioned, service organisations, Cam's touch on that, and I don't tend to go into that in any great depth, but obviously the Type 2 SOC reports are required. If you're using a service provider in the cloud, you will need to get that information. We did make a recommendation in last year's results report that it would be nice if Office of Digital Government or the relevant agency could coordinate the obtaining of those SOC reports from those organisations used across government and provide them to all relevant agencies. That doesn't seem to have been the outcome, and we'll pursue that again this year. But that would seem to make sense. If you've engaged someone other than on the CUA, you will need to make sure you're obtaining those things yourselves. So some aspects on the way forward. Continue with the trend that's been emerging this year on following things through. Check, make sure that the findings are being actioned, and make sure that you're holding your team to account on the timeframes that they've set to respond to things. Make sure that they aren't moving, and we're doing our bit to make sure that we're reflecting on the year it was and working forward as much as we can to bring things forward for reasons I'll get to in a moment. With that said, I'm going to hand over now, or not hand over, move on to the state, from the state to local government. And I'm going to push through this because these have been tabled quite a few months ago, so I'm assuming that they have been reviewed to a fair degree. Most importantly, this year, in the year that was for 22, we did include the top 20 entities. And what's interesting in this, so they are all to be commended for making it in the inaugural list. But what's important, there are only 4 cities in that category. So there's 100 in this year, 148 local governments, only 4 cities in the top 20, which to me was counterintuitive, given the resources most of those have got compared to many regionals. And what's really pleasing is that there are a large number of regional local governments in this, and some relatively small. Now, you might conclude, well, that's because they're small, it's much easier. They've got more resource constraints than most others. So it actually is a commendable effort. The year at a glance, it tells an interesting story. So by the time we issued this report, which, as I say, it didn't get out until we'd finalised, so it was dated up till the 30th of June. So there were still 2 outstanding LGs from the 22 year. I can advise that one of those is now done and one still not. And we'll touch more on that at a moment. In terms of, and included, not in these numbers, we actually issued 16 opinions on the 21 results during the 22-3 year. So that tells you how busy the team have been. 91 of the entities, or 61%, were conducted by and cleared out by the end of December, which is the legislative timeframe. And we're hoping to improve that significantly this year, as we need to, for reasons I'll touch on. If my next slide comes up. So there were 10 qualified opinions, one matter of significance ongoing concern, which is unusual. there were 880 management control findings, which I'll touch on, and there were some 17 emphasis of matters paragraphs, which is a significant decrease from the 31 in the prior year. Most of those relate to prior period error or restatements, which have separate disclosure, and we bring attention to that in the accounts, in our opinion. What is interesting is that while that's decreasing, that there are still a significant number of prior errors being found across the sector. So that's something we're also paying a particular attention to see what the root cause of those are. Similarly, with audit differences, similar trend, less in number, and the average number per entity is less than that was in the state sector. So that is a positive. Interestingly, here there were some 27 entities that had 5 or more adjustments, 4 that had 10 or more, and the highest number was 14, which would tend to indicate the state of those accounts were not, as with many of those, were not as good as they need to be. And they were typically on asset valuations, asset classifications, fair value recording, and income and revenue generation or recognition. Again, with the qualifications, most of them were to do with fair value assessments or valuations either not being done or being inappropriately done. As I mentioned, there were 2 entities outstanding last year. We've also issued, one of those is now done. There were some disclaimers of opinion, and one of those was, and the other one that's remaining is likely to be that, but we'll wait and see. That's just our inability to form, to get the adequate information to form the opinion one way or the other. So that's not a great position for us to be in, but we are working with those agencies to see what they can change up coming forward. So the financial management control findings, there were 880, as you'll see in the right-hand side of the slide. So that number is a significant increase from the prior year, but it's sort of similar to what was done in 2018-19. I guess the most important trend here is consistent with the state sector, in that the number of findings from prior year that are unresolved has been increasing. I don't know what this year's it will look like. We're only just starting that audit, but my fear is some of those items will be continuing. So again, any attention to be able to action those as quickly and timely as you can would be greatly appreciated. I'm going to pass over that. In terms of the control findings, there's 2 in here that you'll see from which are asset management and governance, which are increased this year's in the 22 year. Again, not surprisingly, most of those relate to, on the asset management, to the fair value or obtaining valuations as necessary, and inaccuracies in fixed asset registers and reconciliations. With the governance, it's really around the inadequacy of or the late preparation of risk management plans and strategic plans. So again, given Cam's comments earlier on IT-related stuff, that is a particular area of focus for local governments. Some themes coming through from that report, many of which will prevail this year, I suspect, as I just mentioned, evaluation of assets, about inconsistencies in the valuation techniques, obtaining appropriate valuers, being undertaken, and assessing components of them. Reconciliations, similarly, across not only bank, but across reconciliations of receivables, payables, and the like. Journals being approved, and key financial transactions and ratios not being appropriately attended to. There have been a raft of local government reforms, and we've been advocating for a while, even pre my time in particular, for the department to do more in this area, and they certainly have been. There were a range of changes for that are applicable for 23, some of which were at our instigation in terms of some areas for consideration, and others that they've been doing with themselves. And there's another raft of changes that are coming again in for 24. So I'd be paying particular attention and consideration for those when they come out. This slide, besides always referring to our better practice guides and reports generally, there was a new better practice guide last year, which I know is getting significantly used by local governments in particular on our audit readiness tool. But we also issued a letter to local government entities earlier on this year around some aspects pertaining to timeliness, which all goes to endeavouring to reduce costs. And the reason for that was in that letter we articulate we're targeting the 8th of December completion for local government audits this year, so we're inside of our December timeframe. This is our internal dashboard, and the reason for showing it to you is there are some 147 audits to be done. We've signed out 6, so there's a lot to get done in a relatively short period of time. And in particular, when you look at this slide, which shows the number of audits that are currently targeted to be done in the last week of November and the first week or so of December, it's going to be a busy time. So what we are seeing is some emerging trends that there are some local governments that are struggling to honour that timeframe, and we're working with them as to how we might work through those aspects. But there are some emerging themes in that which will become problematic. In particular, around prior period errors to do with valuations, and themes in that around identifying new assets. And the question for us is, are they actually new assets, or are you simply identifying what was part of a larger asset and now wishing to ascribe some new value to it? So therefore, is it an error or is it just a change of estimation? So there's some things that are emerging which we're working through. And equally, I know many local governments have had difficulty getting hold of a valuer to issue their report in the timeframe required, which is causing them and us some concern. And that's part of the reforms coming forward, which I've talked about in other forums in our liaison with the local government department. They are looking to put forward a change, the regs, which will actually mean that evaluations only need to be done every 5 years, and in the intervening years, the prior valuation will remain. The other emerging theme is resourcing, and quite a few local governments have indicated to us that they just don't have staff or finance people, and even if they've had them, they've now lost them, and how do they access the right people to get everything done in the time frame? So it's a challenge for us, it's a challenge for them, but we'll continue to work forward as best we can. The final thing I just wanted to mention in this year coming up, you will, in most of the state sector entities that we've had exit briefings and with that letter to local government, we've advised that we're changing our audit methodology, and not insignificantly, and our audit tool that we use, our platform we operate on. That's of no great concern to you, other than as a consequence of doing that, we are looking at the timing of our audits, and we will need to typically spread out the work over a longer period. There will be more questions you'll get asked, so bear with us. The first year will be a little bit more tiresome for all of us, but we are making sure we're adjusting as best we can to accommodate that. And as a consequence, there will be a new engagement letter that will need to be issued, and that will be coming in the near future. And just to let you know, as we normally do, there are a raft of entities that are coming up at the end of their contract, both state and local government. We will go through a tender process for 2 reasons. One, to make sure we've got the right firms supporting us and you, and we've also market testing pricing. So bear with us. We will communicate that both to the all relevant entities in as timely as we can. But that will be another piece of work that will be an impost on your organisations to some degree if it's time. With that said, I'm a little overdue, I suspect, but I'll. If there's any questions, I'll endeavour to answer them or redirect them to Sandra.
That's fine. Okay. And do we have any questions online? No?
Even better.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sandra.
Quick question.
Go on.
Sorry. In terms of financial audits and other organisations, we're able to get the level of materiality quoted to us. When seeking that information for OAG audits, we're told we can't have that information. I think it's an important part of understanding what sort of figures are being considered in the audit, but without knowing the total materiality, I think it's a concern. Will that be able to be changed?
I understand your concern. The short answer to that, and it's a bit like fees, is we won't disclose that. That's for us to determine. And a large part of the logic behind that and the rationale is that's for us to assess using our methodology, providing what the materialities that we're working towards to the organisations can be used, and I've seen it where it has, to work out what numbers fall below that, and what numbers need to get moved from one category to another in order to being below materiality. Now, I'm not suggesting in this audience is doing that, but that's part of the rationale for keeping that materiality for us to determine. Sorry, Sandra.
Yeah. I think what's also really relevant here, and we've touched on that a little bit in our preparation of the Financial Statements Better Practice Guide, is that internally an organisation also needs to set a threshold to go, above what number do we think that we need to make adjustments to our financial statements? And we call that the internal or the financial statement preparation materiality. And that's actually the number that you should be looking for, to be going, well, has the CFO had that discussion with management and or the audit committee? And if not, it's something that we'd suggest that you ask them, to ask the CFO, well, what is the number that you're considering to be material in the context of these financial statements? And then to make your own judgment as to whether you're comfortable with that number. Yeah. Sorry, the other reason why materiality for us as auditors isn't just a number, it's about the context as well, which is equally important. And that's why to provide a number is, I guess it's just a particular line in the sand, but it does depend on the impact and the context, and what other things we need to consider. So it's not just about having a materiality number. Yeah. Any other questions?
Take two.
Yep, thank you. Right, so thank you, Grant. I would just like to thank you all for being here today, for sharing your time with us. And if there's anything that you would like us to cover in our next forum, which is likely to be in the first quarter-ish of next year, please let us know. If you want to keep track of any of our audits, if you want to understand and know what's happening, I'd invite you to visit our website and follow us on any of our social media accounts. And then once in every 2 years, we actually survey the audit committee chairs, and I would encourage you to take part in that. We want to find out how you engage with audits, what audit topics you perceive the best value, and what kind of things we can be doing to better serve you. So thank you very much for your attendance online and in person. For those of you here, welcome you to enjoy some refreshments with us outside, and thank you very much. See you next time.